Number 10. Roman Defectiones. The Roman world is often remembered for its roads, its laws, and its vast military power. But beneath that orderly surface was another reality, one filled with fear, rivalry, jealousy, and quiet desperation. One of the clearest windows into that darker side of Roman life comes from objects known as defectiones, curse tablets made to bind, punish, or ruin another person through ritual. These tablets were usually thin sheets of lead, inscribed with names, accusations, and requests directed toward gods, spirits, or underworld powers. Some were written against thieves, others targeted lovers, business rivals, political enemies, or competitors in public games. The language could be cold, specific, and deeply personal, as if the writer believed that simply placing a name into the right ritual context could set unseen forces into motion. What makes the ritual so disturbing is how deliberate it was. These were not just angry words scratched in private. The tablets were often folded, pierced, nailed, or hidden in graves, wells, temples, and springs, places believed to bring the curse closer to divine or chthonic powers. In some cases, the ritual itself mattered as much as the text. The act of wounding the metal was meant to wound the victim. The burial of the tablet was meant to deliver the message into the hands of the dead. And that is what makes Roman curse rituals so unsettling. They reveal ordinary people turning ritual into a weapon, not in moments of myth or legend, but in the everyday world of theft, betrayal, love, and revenge. Somewhere in the Roman Empire, someone sat down, wrote another person's name into cold metal, and entrusted hatred to the unseen. The tablets remain as proof that ancient ritual was not always about worship. Sometimes it was about making sure someone else suffered. Number 9. The Egyptian opening of the mouth ceremony. Ancient Egypt is filled with monuments to death. But for the Egyptians, death was never meant to be silence. It was a transition, dangerous and uncertain, and one that required careful ritual to ensure the dead could continue to exist beyond the grave. Among the most unsettling ceremonies in that system was the opening of the mouth ritual, performed on mummies, coffins, and funerary statues to symbolically restore the senses of the deceased. The logic behind the ritual was clear within Egyptian belief. A person entering the afterlife needed to breathe, speak, see, hear, and receive offerings. Without those capacities, eternity itself could become a kind of deprivation. Priests therefore used specially designed ceremonial instruments, including adze-like tools and other ritual implements, to touch the mouth, eyes, and face of the dead or their sacred representation. This was not medicine, it was a spiritual reactivation of a being that had already crossed the boundary of life. That origin is what makes the ceremony so haunting. The body was preserved, dressed, and prepared, but preservation alone was not enough. The dead still had to be awakened into ritual function. In effect, the ceremony was an attempt to reopen a human being to the next world, to make a silent face speak again and a lifeless mouth receive breath beyond death. It reveals an ancient fear that dying was not the true danger. The true danger was arriving in the afterlife unable to function within it. What survives from this ritual are its tools, depictions, and echoes in funerary tradition, enough to show how seriously the Egyptians took the possibility that eternity required intervention. Somewhere in a tomb lit by flame and incense, priests stood over the dead and performed acts meant to restore what life had taken away. And that is what gives the opening of the mouth its disturbing power even now. It is a ritual built on the belief that death could not be left alone. It had to be managed, corrected, and opened. Number 8. Ancient Greek animal sacrifice. To the modern world, ancient Greece is often associated with philosophy, democracy, theatre, and the foundations of Western thought. But in the daily religious life of the Greeks, one of the most central acts was far more visceral. It was sacrifice, not symbolic in the abstract sense, but real animals brought to altars, consecrated before the gods, killed in public ritual, and offered as part of a sacred exchange between mortals and the divine. What makes the practice so unsettling is how normal it was. This was not an occasional act reserved only for extreme moments. Animal sacrifice stood at the center of civic religion, festival life, warfare, thanksgiving, and communal identity. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs could be adorned, led in procession, sprinkled, blessed, and then slaughtered before assembled crowds. The gods received smoke, fat, bones, and ritual honor, while the human community consumed the meat in a structured, sacred meal. Religion, violence, and social order were all bound together in a single act. That is exactly why it feels so disturbing from a modern perspective. The ritual was not hidden. It was public, formal, and meaningful. The death of the animal was not treated as incidental, but as the necessary point of contact between worlds. Blood marked the seriousness of the offering. Fire carried part of it upward. The altar became the place where human need met divine expectation. In a society that prized beauty, reason, and ceremony, sacred killing was not a contradiction. It was part of how the world was believed to stay in balance. And that is what gives Greek sacrifice its darker power. It reveals that some of the ancient world's most admired civilizations built divine order on acts modern people would struggle to witness comfortably. Somewhere in a sanctuary filled with prayer, music, and incense, an animal was held at the center of a crowd and turned into an offering because people believed the gods required it. The ritual was beautiful in form, but brutal in function, and that tension still lingers around it now. Number 7. Celtic bog depositions. Across parts of ancient northern Europe, people carried weapons, ornaments, tools, cauldrons, and other valuable objects into the wetlands and left them there to disappear beneath dark water and peat. These acts, now described as bog depositions, were not accidents or simple losses. They were deliberate ritual offerings placed into landscapes that were likely seen as thresholds between the human world and something beyond it. That setting is what makes the practice so eerie. A bog is neither solid land nor open water. It is unstable, cold, and half alive, a place that seems to swallow what enters it. In many ancient belief systems, such places carried a liminal quality, a sense that they stood near the edges of ordinary reality. To place precious metal, weapons, or symbolic goods into a bog was to surrender them completely. The object was not meant to return. It was meant to be taken. Some discoveries make the ritual feel even darker. Archaeologists have found not only objects, but also human bodies preserved in bog conditions with astonishing clarity. Not every bog body can be explained in the same way, and interpretations remain careful and debated. But taken together with the offerings, they suggest that these wetlands were more than natural spaces. They may have functioned as sacred zones where people gave up things of value, and in some cases perhaps even life itself, to powers they could not safely ignore. That is what makes Celtic bog depositions so disturbing. The ritual depended on irreversible loss. Someone walked to the edge of black water carrying something precious and chose to let it vanish forever. Whether the purpose was devotion, fear, gratitude, protection, or sacrifice, the meaning was serious enough to justify permanent surrender. The objects that return from those bogs today do not feel merely old. They feel like things that were meant to stay hidden, buried in a ritual darkness that ancient people believed was still listening. Number 6. Moche human sacrifice. On the northern coast of ancient Peru, the Moche built a civilization of astonishing artistry, power, and ritual intensity. Their ceramics, murals, and metalwork reveal a world where warfare, status, religion, and blood were deeply intertwined. And among the darkest parts of that world was the practice of human sacrifice, a ritual act that appears not only in Moche imagery, but in archaeological evidence recovered from ceremonial sites. What makes Moche sacrifice so disturbing is how clearly it seems to have been integrated into the symbolic order of society. This was not random killing hidden at the edges of culture. It appears to have been staged, formalized, and charged with meaning. Moche art repeatedly shows bound captives, elite figures, and ritual scenes involving blood offerings, suggesting that sacrifice was understood as part of the relationship between political power and sacred necessity. Violence was not outside the ritual. Violence was the ritual. Excavations have only made that reality harder to ignore. At sites such as Huaca de la Luna, archaeologists uncovered human remains that strongly support the idea that captives were killed in ceremonial contexts. The evidence suggests a world in which sacrifice could be performed publicly, perhaps in response to cosmic events, social instability, warfare, or the demands of priestly ideology. In that setting, the body itself became an offering, not merely destroyed, but transformed into a medium between human society and supernatural power. That is what gives Moche human sacrifice its terrifying force. It reveals a civilization of extraordinary refinement that also built sacred meaning through deliberate death. Somewhere in the ancient Andes, a captive was brought into ritual space, surrounded by authority, symbolism, and spectators, and killed because a society believed that blood itself could sustain order. The beauty of Moche art survives. So does the horror of what some of that art was really showing. Number 5. Aztec heart extraction rituals. Few ancient rituals have become as infamous as the sacrificial ceremonies of the Aztecs, and at the center of that reputation stands one image above all others: the extraction of the human heart. To modern eyes, it is almost unbearable to imagine. But within the Aztec world, this was not senseless cruelty. It was one of the most powerful acts through which humans repaid a debt to the gods and helped sustain the cosmic order itself. The logic behind the ritual was rooted in an intense vision of the universe. The gods had sacrificed themselves to create and sustain the world, and human beings were therefore obligated to return life in the form of blood and hearts. In this worldview, sacrifice was not peripheral, it was central to survival. The sun itself, the movement of time, the balance of existence, all could be imagined as depending on the continuation of sacred offering. That made the ritual not merely acceptable, but necessary. What makes it so disturbing today is the scale and solemnity of it. Victims were brought to temple tops, held in place, and offered before both divine and human audiences. Priests used ritual blades to open the body and remove the heart while it was still understood to carry living force. This was violence transformed into theology, death turned into cosmic maintenance. It was public, structured, and embedded in one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the pre-Columbian world. And that is why Aztec heart extraction rituals remain so haunting. They force us to confront a belief system in which fear, devotion, power, and sacred duty became inseparable. Somewhere in the heart of an empire, surrounded by temples, banners, and prayer, a human life was opened in front of the gods because people believed the universe demanded it. The ritual was horrifying, but to those who performed it, horror may have been the very proof of its seriousness. Number 4. Inca Capacocha. High in the Andes, where the air thins and the mountains feel closer to the heavens than the world below, the Inca carried out one of the most haunting rituals in ancient history. Known as Capacocha, it was a state ceremony involving the sacrifice of children, often chosen for their beauty, status, or symbolic purity, and sent on a final journey to some of the highest sacred peaks in the empire. To the modern mind, it is almost impossible to absorb. But within the Inca worldview, it was not seen as meaningless death. It was an offering of immense spiritual importance. What makes Capacocha so disturbing is the combination of tenderness and horror. The children selected for the ritual were not treated as criminals or enemies. They were dressed with extraordinary care, adorned with fine textiles and precious objects, and prepared as if for a sacred transformation. In many cases, they were taken far from home and brought to remote mountain summits, places the Inca regarded as holy, powerful, and deeply connected to the gods, the ancestors, and the order of the empire itself. The mountains were not just landscape, they were living presences. Archaeological discoveries have made the ritual feel even more immediate. Frozen high-altitude burials have preserved some of these children with heartbreaking clarity, showing faces, clothing, and offerings that survived because the cold never let them fully return to the earth. That preservation makes the ritual especially unsettling, because it removes the distance people often feel from the ancient past. These were not abstract sacrifices hidden in myth. They were real children, placed into silence at the edge of the sky because an empire believed the gods demanded purity, devotion, and submission on the highest possible level. That is what gives Capacocha its terrifying power. It reveals a ritual in which love, beauty, reverence, and death became inseparable. Somewhere in the Andes, a child was led upward through ceremony and honor toward a fate they may not have fully understood, while the adults around them believed they were participating in one of the empire's most sacred acts. It is a reminder that some of the ancient world's most disturbing rituals were not always the bloodiest in appearance. Sometimes they were the quietest. Number 3. Teotihuacan dedication sacrifices. Long before the Aztecs rose to power, another great city dominated central Mexico with monumental architecture, cosmic order, and an influence that spread across vast regions. That city was Teotihuacan, and beneath its grand pyramids and carefully planned avenues lay evidence of rituals far darker than its impressive stone facades first suggest. Among the most disturbing of these were dedication sacrifices, offerings made during the construction or consecration of major sacred structures. What makes these rituals so chilling is the idea behind them. A temple or pyramid was not simply built and then used. It had to be spiritually activated, sealed, or bound to the sacred order of the city. Archaeologists have found human remains buried in ceremonial contexts associated with major constructions along with animals, obsidian blades, and other offerings. In some cases, the victims appear to have been placed deliberately as part of the foundation or dedication of the structure itself, as though blood and death were required to give the building power. That transforms the city in a deeply unsettling way. Teotihuacan is often admired for its scale, symmetry, and urban sophistication, but those same monuments may have been inaugurated through acts of ritual violence. The walls were not only raised by labor, they may also have been consecrated through sacrifice. Human beings became part of the sacred architecture, absorbed into the foundations of a city that presented itself as cosmic, ordered, and eternal. And that is what makes Teotihuacan's dedication sacrifices so disturbing. They suggest that one of the most impressive urban centers in the ancient Americas may have embedded death into its very structure. Somewhere in the shadow of a rising temple, priests, rulers, or ritual specialists oversaw ceremonies in which a life was not just taken, but placed into stone and space so the city itself could live. It is a brutal reminder that in some ancient traditions, sacred architecture was not complete when the last stone was set. It was complete when something living had been given to it. Number 2. Etruscan funerary rites. Before Rome dominated the Italian peninsula, the Etruscans had already built a civilization shaped by ceremony, ancestor memory, and an unusually intimate relationship with death. Their tombs were not treated as empty chambers for the dead. They were carefully prepared spaces filled with paintings, objects, symbols, and funerary furnishings meant to preserve status, identity, and continuity beyond the grave. In that world, death was not simply an ending. It was a passage that required ritual structure. What makes Etruscan funerary rites so disturbing is the way they blur the boundary between remembrance and presence. The dead were not always imagined as fully gone. Through tomb art, sculpted sarcophagi, grave goods, and ritual performance, the deceased remained socially and spiritually important. Banquet scenes, reclining figures, and carefully arranged burial spaces suggest that the dead were being situated within a continuing order, one that linked family, memory, and the afterlife in ways that still feel strangely close and strangely cold at the same time. There is something deeply unsettling about a culture that preserved the human face, the human body, and the symbols of life so carefully inside a world built for the dead. These rituals were not casual gestures of mourning. They were deliberate acts meant to guide, honor, and perhaps stabilize the relationship between the living and those who had crossed over. The tomb became more than a resting place. It became a controlled environment where identity could survive in ritual form even after the body had entered decay. That is what gives Etruscan funerary rites their disturbing force. Somewhere in ancient Italy, people stood inside painted tombs and carried out ceremonies designed to keep the dead ordered, remembered, and symbolically present. It was beautiful in craftsmanship, but eerie in purpose, because beneath the artistry lies a darker truth. Some ancient rituals were not meant to let the dead go. They were meant to keep them close. Number 1, Mesopotamian underworld and protective demon rituals. If there is one ritual world on this list that feels closest to pure ancient fear, it is the world of Mesopotamian underworld and protective demon rituals. In the earliest cities of Mesopotamia, people did not only fear war, disease, and hunger. They also feared hostile supernatural forces that could enter the home, attack the body, torment children, disturb sleep, and bring sudden ruin. The unseen was not abstract, it was immediate, and ritual existed to defend against it. What makes these practices so chilling is that they were built around the belief that danger was always nearby. Demons, restless forces, curses, and malevolent beings were not simply stories told to frighten children. They were treated as active threats requiring response. Ritual specialists used incantations, plaques, amulets, figurines, and carefully prescribed ceremonies to repel, bind, or redirect those powers. Some rites invoked stronger divine beings to overpower the threat. Others placed protective objects in houses, near beds, or around vulnerable family members, especially mothers and infants. Among the most unsettling figures tied to this world were beings such as Lamashtu, associated in Mesopotamian belief with attacks on pregnant women and children. Protective rituals were not decorative religion. They were emergency measures against a reality people believed could break into ordinary life at any moment. The image of the demon, the spoken incantation, the placement of the plaque, all of it formed part of a ritual defense system against terror that was thought to be real, personal, and close. That is why this takes the number 1 place. These rituals were not shocking because they were public spectacles of blood, but because they reveal how ancient people lived with the constant sense that invisible forces could be feeding on the weak, entering the home, or waiting just beyond the threshold of light. Somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, a family placed a protective image in the darkness and spoke words they hoped would keep the night from answering back. And that may be the most disturbing ritual of all, not one built around a temple or a king, but around the belief that fear itself had to be ritualized just to survive it.